Okay, I think we're going to start, and people will be joining us as they go along. Greetings to everyone who's joining us for this seminar. I'm the director of the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional Public Human Rights International Law. My name is David Bilchitz, and this is a center of the University of Johannesburg. And we welcome you together with the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of the Witwatersrand and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre. We have collaborated together and welcome you to this important online panel discussion on the topic of environmental destruction and ecocide, ethical and legal perspectives. I'm grateful to the initiative of our partners who recognize that the environmental crisis we face raises an important need for collaboration across disciplines and institutions. Serious harms to the environment are visible around us at present and increasingly leading to really terrible effects on humans and other animals. In South Africa, we recently saw the terrible harmful effects of flooding in UKZN, and in Europe this summer there has been an unprecedented drought. And there are, of course, others. We think of Pakistan as well with the flooding and so many others. Other weather events, extreme weather events taking place. And those effects are in turn having impacts on people, leading to displacement, impacts on other creatures, and also then having a range of political effects with various conflicts. And we're going to hear the potential for really serious international crimes as well, such as genocide. There is a clear interrelationship between ourselves, other animals, and the environment, a relationship ignored to our peril. And that these harmful effects increasingly have led to questions of how do we respond ethically and legally to environmental harm and destruction. And so this webinar arose and a number of questions arise. What are some of the likely impacts of environmental destruction and climate change on humans and other animals? In a sense, this requires us to think about the empirical linkages and the likely effects of what will in fact occur and which are starting to become evident. We wanted to ask a question about, particularly being institutions rooted in South Africa, would an African ethic be well placed to help us address our responsibilities in this area? And of course, this raises the question of which ethical framework is best placed to enable us to address these kinds of harms and take on board our responsibilities. And then is the creation of a new crime, international crime of ecocide, useful in capturing these serious harms to the environment and criminalizing such actions? And this raises the question of what should the legal response be? And is criminal law, for instance, useful in this sphere? And there are questions as well about other legal frameworks being utilized, like the rights of nature, which has been a concept that's come up recently. Does that help us straddle the boundary between the ethical and the legal? And what role does rights talk have in this sphere? And so tonight we have a fascinating panel to address these questions from a range of perspectives. But before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to thank our collaborators in making this event possible. Professor Merle Williams, who is an incredible academic, who was my own lecturer in English literature, in her role at the African Center for the Study of the United States, and Adam Levine, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the center, Tali Nates, who's a founder and executive director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre, a visionary in this respect, and Danielle Hofscher, who's the projects and events officer for that same institution, and Ntombenhle Mpungose, operations assistant at the Johannesburg Genocide and Holocaust Centre, and also Naomi Hove, who was an administrator at SAIFAC and helped us enable this, as well as Ropa Fatso Maposo, who also helped us with advertising. So thank you to all who made this happen, and we're looking forward to a wonderful discussion. There will be an opportunity as well. We're going to have presentations from each of our speakers, and then we're going to have an opportunity for questions and engagement. And we hope that this will be a lively audience, giving us an opportunity for putting your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand as well, and we will take live questions. It's always nice to have a dialogue, so please feel free to do so, but you can also, if you don't feel you want to, you can put your question in the chat. So without further ado, let us jump into the heart of our discussion. And our first speaker tonight is going to be Professor Alexander Alvarez, who is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. From 2001 until 2003, he was the founding director of the Martin Springer Institute for Teaching the Holocaust, Tolerance, and Humanitarian Values. And in 2017 to 2018, he served as the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. His main areas of study are in the areas of collective and interpersonal violence, and he has many books to his name, and I saw a really impressive list, but I'm going to mention his latest one, Unstable Ground, Climate Change, Conflict, and Genocide, which was published in July 2017 with Rowman and Littlefield. We can try and share the link in the chat as well to his book, and deals with issues that are really relevant to the seminar. He has also served as an editor on many journals and been invited around the world to speak. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Alvarez. Thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you also for this invitation to speak here. And I do want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. I'm not sure how to more generally, start off, because it's hard in these Zoom webinars to know whether I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or something along those lines. But anyway, hello. I'm happy to be here, and I hope that what I have to say today makes some sense for all of you. There's a lot of material, and I want to briefly just cover some of it, and I hope that I put it together in a way that makes some kind of sense. So the theme of ecocide, the focus of this webinar, is a topic that's been increasingly the subject of a lot of both academic as well as public attention. And we seem to be realizing, as David indicated, that the ecological destruction that we have inflicted on the world around us poses a tremendous threat to not just ecosystems, flora, fauna, and the like, but to humanity as well. What we're learning the hard way is we are not apart from the natural world, but are instead a part of the natural world. Now, my particular talk today concerns an issue that is inextricably linked with ecocide, and that is climate change. And again, as David briefly mentioned, all around the world, we are seeing dramatic and sometimes catastrophic changes in once fairly stable and predictable weather patterns. Once rare weather events are becoming ever more common and ever more extreme. And what the evidence is suggesting is that we are catching glimpses of what the coming years and decades hold in store for us. And we're not just imagining this either. The science of climate change continues to expand and inform our understanding of the complicated nature of the forces that we've set into motion. And report after report lays out in stark and sometimes pretty grim detail the ways in which the direct and indirect consequences of climate change pose significant threats to the health and well-being of humans around the world on a scale we have not experienced in the modern world. And these changes threaten to overwhelm the ability of communities and states to cope, to ameliorate, and to adapt. Change, we all know, is always stressful, both for individuals and communities. And as our world warms, societies all around the world have to confront this new reality and the consequences it poses for our political, our social, our economic structures and institutions. And these changes, one way we can look upon them are, they are stressors. And they will come in rapid succession, with each of them amplifying consequences of the other. And it will challenge our resiliency and our ability to cope and to adapt. This, I would argue, is a recipe for conflict and violence, including warfare and, in its most extreme form, genocide. Now, more than 30 years of studying violence, especially genocide and mass atrocity crimes, has taught me a fair bit about the nature of these kinds of violence. We know that these forms of conflict don't just happen or erupt out of nowhere. Instead, we have to understand that there are specific triggers and precipitants that can help facilitate violent and exterminatory reactions and solutions. Now, my work in particular explores the particular ways in which the various consequences of climate change can foster and facilitate different forms of group violence. And specifically, I've been examining the ways in which changes in our climate systems heighten the risk for the development of communal and ethnic warfare, civil war, and genocide. I explore, for example, the ways in which scarce or diminishing resources, such as fresh potable water, will heighten competition and tension between communities and nations as they struggle to protect, control, or acquire water and other resources they need to survive and thrive. Around the world, we know that water has already been a flashpoint for violent conflict and has dramatically heightened tensions between nations such as India and Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, Yemen and Saudi Arabia, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, to name just a few. We shouldn't be surprised to learn that it has already been linked to violent conflict and genocide in places such as the Darfur region of the Sudan, as well as Syria. Currently, around 1/4 of the world's population is dealing with extreme water stress and critical shortages that are only projected to worsen by 2025, when estimates suggest that around 3.5 billion people will be forced to deal with water scarcity issues. Access to potable water is literally a life and death issue, and we shouldn't be surprised that it is increasingly a source of conflict and even violence at the local, national, and regional levels. Now, another issue, one that I want to focus a little more time on, concerns population displacement, arguably one of the most significant impacts for humanity. Projections suggest a massive increase in the number of people displaced in the coming decades as people are forced out of their homes and communities by the direct and indirect consequences of climate change. Direct, think about things like climate events like storms, flooding, and so forth. Fast and cataclysmic. Climate processes are a little slower acting, things like long-term drought that progressively make life more difficult or unlivable in particular areas. Indirect includes things such as wars, revolutions, and the like. And we know that historically, population displacement, the single most common cause of it has been violent conflict, wars and civil wars in particular. Currently, according to the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, there are more than 100 million people who have been forcibly displaced around the world because of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or related kinds of disturbances. This represents about 1 out of every 78 people on this planet. Now, keep in mind, this number also does not take into account migrants who are typically classified in very different ways. These are record high levels of displacement. Yet these numbers, as dramatic as they are, represent only a fraction of what we can expect. Some projections suggest that by 2050, we may see 500 to 700 million people on the move. I've even recently seen some projections that suggest we may reach the billion threshold. Think about that for a second. Think about what these impersonal numbers represent in terms of human suffering and trauma. Think also about what it means for the communities that they're coming from and the ones to which they are headed. Whether as migrants, refugees, internally displaced persons, or some other categories, perhaps some that we haven't even really created yet in terms of climate or environmental refugees and the like. History teaches us that large-scale population movements have often destabilized nations, and it tells us that it has often resulted in social unrest and large amounts of violence, including pogroms, civil war, revolution. Not only can such large influxes disrupt a society, but it can also lead to violent persecution and scapegoating against those displaced who may not be welcomed in the communities and regions to which they flee in search of safety and security. We need only think about the recent treatment of refugees and migrants in the United States and Europe, for example, to get a sense of how population displacement may feed into persecution and violence. Here in the US, we're engaged in a process of what many criminologists have referred to as crimmigration, the criminalization of immigration, in which immigration is defined as a national emergency and a crisis. Refugees fleeing political and gang violence in various Central American countries, for example, are often portrayed as being composed largely of murderers, rapists, drug dealers, and it is argued that our national security depends on stopping them from entering the US and claiming refugee status. Similar things are happening in Europe, as well as in other parts of the world, such as Bangladesh, which has seen a large upswing in anti-immigrant policy, hostility, and even violence against members of the Rohingya minority, who have been displaced into neighboring Bangladesh by the genocide against them in Myanmar. These vulnerable groups have all too often been labeled, dehumanized, and attacked. This isn't a problem for just one nation or region. All nations will experience significant population shifts. It appears that the human climate niche is shrinking dramatically, and a lot more people are going to be on the move in search of security, safety, and opportunity in the coming decades. And all of these will strain the ability of communities and states to meet the needs of their citizens. It will heighten tensions among and between communities, populations, and nations. And it can encourage othering and scapegoating of those who are defined as being different, dangerous, or simply superfluous. It's also important, I believe, to understand the political context within which these climate change-induced challenges must be met. And the news on that front is, in my opinion, also very troubling. The evidence tells us that we are living in an era in which exclusionary forms of nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism have made significant gains. In many nations, liberal democracy has been on the retreat. Have you been following the situation in Belarus over this last year? Russia and Ukraine, China and the treatment of the Uyghurs, or the suppression of rights in Hong Kong, for example? If so, I think you might have a sense of what I'm talking about. One commentator put it simply when he wrote, "It's been a good decade for dictatorship. Conversely, it's been a terrible decade for democracy." And even long-established and ostensibly strong democracies have not been immune to this trend, as a number of Western European countries, for example, such as Germany, Austria, Denmark, Italy, Holland, and France, have experienced a dramatic rise in popular support for far-right political parties that typically espouse extreme nativist, xenophobic, and nationalist agendas. Now, all of these political movements have been guided and shaped by local concerns and issues, but they've also shared an intolerance of outsiders and have invariably stoked anti-immigrant fear and hostility. Even the US has not been immune to these challenges. According to research from the Varieties of Democracy Institute, in recent years, the US has experienced substantial autocratization, in which democratic attributes have been diminished or lost. And further research indicates that in the US and Europe, popular support for democratic principles and practices have diminished, while support for non-democratic modes of government have increased. These populist sentiments appear to be directly related to increased rates of violence directed at those groups perceived as others or outsiders. And so as a result, we have seen hate crime, anti-immigrant violence, and other forms of intolerance, prejudice, and conflict at record levels in many nations. I would also argue that we have seen this recent pandemic accelerate this tendency in some locales when political leaders have exploited COVID-19 to accelerate the dismantling of democratic institutions and constraints. The pandemic has also amplified existing social, political, and religious schisms that have sometimes resulted in extremists targeting religious minorities, militants and terrorists ramping up their violence against immigrant and ethnic minority communities, and it has amplified various existing kinds of conflicts. Now, I highlight this recent drift towards exclusionary nationalism since it is a situation tailor-made for the development of violent responses posed by the problems created by climate change. When states consolidate power within a small group of elites and they curtail legal rights and protections, persecution and repression become much easier. Simply put, there are few to none institutional and structural checks on the unbridled exercise of power. Authoritarian states tend to be more extreme and radical in their approaches to problems as well, and are particularly dangerous when the national community is narrowly defined to include only members of a particular racial, ethnic, or religious groups. In those locations, minority populations defined as outsiders or newcomers, especially those as portrayed as posing a threat or as competing for scarce resources or jobs, are particularly vulnerable to various kinds of rhetoric and violence. So as nations deal with resource loss, environmental degradation, population dislocation, and various other climate-induced or facilitated issues, I argue that violence becomes not only possible, but more probable. And this is especially true in places where there's a history of intolerance and persecution. We know that old hatreds often reappear during unsettled times. They tend to gain new resonance. And it's not difficult to conceive how such processes can play out in a nation or region struggling to deal with all of the stresses, hardship, and uncertainty brought about by the consequences of climate change. When confronted with diminishing resources, social instability, and rising numbers of displaced populations, popular fear and prejudice can easily germinate into persecution, violent conflict, and even more radical programs of expulsion and maybe even extermination. We also know that during troubled times, punitive attitudes and opinions tend to develop, grow, and harden. People tend to become more reactive, more hostile, and even aggressive in their thinking. And we know that political leaders have often historically capitalized on such feelings and sentiments. We know that research has shown that economic uncertainty and downturns are typically followed by more conservative and intolerant societies in terms of attitudes and policies. Uncertainty and fear doesn't bring out the best in us always. It can breed intolerance and hostility against those perceived to be outsiders, and especially if they're seen as unfairly benefiting from a society. So for these kinds of reasons, an increasingly authoritarian world, I would argue, poses some very real dangers for persecution, xenophobia, and many forms of violence. And let's not forget that displaced populations are incredibly vulnerable. Even though we often tend to believe that human rights are invested in ourselves simply because of our status as human beings, in practical terms, those rights are generally protected and enforced by the states within which you are a member. And what happens when that state is no longer willing or able to protect those rights? What happens when it's the state that is actively working against them, or when you no longer have a state? And while there are international protections for displaced populations, we also know that they are extremely limited and often not enforced. And displaced populations are also vulnerable because they are fragmented, atomized, and without power. And by power, I mean things like connections, influence, resources, organization, collective organization, and community, and all the other things that allow a group to shape and influence their condition and their future. So for all these kinds of reasons, I believe that among the most significant risks for climate change, facilitated persecution and violent conflict, it's population displacement that is perhaps one of the most visible and one of the most immediate. Now, I realize I'm pretty much out of time here. I don't want to leave you thinking, that there's no hope. There is. I would argue there are things that can be done and ought to be done. But I think I will leave it there and maybe leave that for any kind of discussion portion of this evening's, afternoon, morning's event, whatever. Anyway, thank you for listening. Hope it made sense. And I'll turn it back over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alvarez, for that very excellent sort of summary of the interconnections that exist, complex interconnections between environmental degradation, population displacement, conflict, and then potentially genocide and serious international crimes. And as I say, you left me thinking, asking the question you asked at the end, so hopefully we will pose that to you. Is this an inevitable descent, or is it something that what can we do in some ways to stop this descent into the state which you describe and the probability of it taking place. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to move to some of those, as I said, Professor Alvarez has laid out some of the harms and also possible effects. And we're now going to look at it from a perspective of the ethics. And we're very grateful to Dr. Stephen and Kansa Morgan for addressing us. And I just should say that Dr. Morgan has stepped in really late when our speaker at the time, Professor Beatrice Okere-Manu, had to withdraw from the seminar due to a family illness. Dr. Morgan, thank you very much. He is a Ghanaian and currently a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Classics at the University of Ghana, where he teaches a wide range of philosophy and ethics courses at both graduate and undergraduate level. Dr. Morgan holds a PhD in ethics studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, a master's in philosophy and Bachelor of Arts as well from the University of Ghana. His research interests are in applied ethics, social and political philosophy, and African philosophy. And he's also previously taught ethics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And I also want to draw your attention to a publication which drew our interest. There's a wonderful book called African Environmental Ethics, a reader by Munamato Chemhuru, who has edited that. And Stephen and Beatrice are co-authors of a chapter dealing with environmental justice from an African perspective. And I know that we're going to have a treat here in understanding a little bit more about the African model of environmental justice. So over to you, Dr. Morgan, and thank you once again.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for having me. I hope I am loud and clear.
We can hear you. Absolutely.
Great, great. So, yes, I'll be speaking to you on an African model of environmental justice and how it addresses environmental wrongs and harms. And I'm very grateful to Alex for such a beautiful presentation, which basically, set the tone for my presentation. Right, so I would like to start with this quote by Atapatu, Gonzalez, and Sek. In 2021, they said, the environment is not and cannot be a leg of the sustainable development stool. It is the floor upon which the stool or any sustainable development model must stand. And I thought this was very fascinating, bringing our mind to the importance of the environment in terms of sustainable development. So I tweaked this a little bit to fit my purpose, and I made it issues in environmental ethics and justice are not and cannot be the pillars of Africa's development agenda. They ought to be the core foundation upon which all the other pillars or any developmental model must stand. And if you think about it critically, this is very, very true, right? Every developmental model that you put across must have environmental sustainability as its focus. And usually when we deal with environmental ethics and environmental sustainability, we barely touch on the injustices that are involved in the environmental challenges. So the literature on environmental injustice is quite small compared to the other aspects of environmental challenges. So let's first of all start with what is popularly known by all of us. We define environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So basically, environmental justice ensures that everybody, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter race or color, has equal and fair distribution of environmental goods and environmental burdens, right? So when we say environmental goods, we mean all the beautiful resources that the environment has to offer us. Everybody has equal share or fair share of it. And then the burdens too that we are faced with, the environmental problems, we all also equally address it. right? So it's not supposed to be a situation where you have few people enjoying the environmental resources while the others are suffering for it. So basically, that's what environmental justice want to deal with or addresses. There are some synonyms for environmental justice. Some people will prefer to use the term environmental racism, but I tend to find environmental racism as inadequate a synonym for environmental justice, because environmental racism is a specific type of environmental injustice. It doesn't encompass every type of environmental injustice. Perhaps a better synonym would be environmental equity or environmental inequality. Environmental racism is predominant in places where there are different races in the population, especially in the United States and in Africa here, especially in South Africa and some other countries within Southern Africa where you have various races there. Right? In South Africa, we have the blacks, we have the colored, we have the whites, and then we have the Indians and all that together. So here it makes sense to talk about environmental racism. But in a place like Ghana, where I am, where we are mostly 95% or more all Black Africans, environmental racism will not actually be adequate a term to use for environmental injustice. Our sort of environmental injustice is not about race. It's not about improper distribution of environmental resources based on racial groupings. No, ours it comes in a different form. So that's why I do not support the idea of using environmental racism as a direct synonym for environmental injustice, right? We'll talk more about the environmental racism perhaps later. Now, also important to the issue of environmental justice is intergenerational justice, right? And this is important because more often than not, the literature forgets about the future generation. It's all about the current generation, how we can use the resources equitably and share, distribute, fair distribution, fair use of environmental burdens and all that. But we forget about the future generation, right? So we need to also have in mind that when we talk about environmental justice, we're not seeking justice for the living generation, but also the unborn generation as well, right? And then this is important when I start to talk about the African aspect of it, right? Other aspect of environmental justice has to do with these four divisions. You have the distributive justice, you have the procedural justice, you have the corrective justice, and then we have what we call the social justice. When distributive justice has to do with how we distribute the various environmental resources, environmental good, and then environmental burdens as well, right? How do we do that equitably, fairly, justly, whatever ethical terms you want to use? And then the procedural justice involves involving the people in the process, right? So it's not a top-bottom approach, but a bottom-top approach, as it were, right? So we include everybody, especially the local folks, in whatever decision that we want to make concerning environmental burdens and environmental goods. Then the corrective justice, how to correct the harm that has been done, how to correct the harm that has been done. That's about corrective justice. Then there is the aspect of social justice, making sure that those who are responsible take responsibility for what they have done, right? So all of these aspects of environmental justice we need to have them in mind when we are talking about how to address issues of environmental justice. Other than that, any proposal that we provide may only look at one aspect of it without dealing with the whole issue as a whole, right? We are very familiar with the impact of climate change and the abuse of the environment. Our first speaker did allude to some of them, so I will not bore you with so much detail, but as you can see, we have a lot of flooding going on in many African countries. In South Africa, we experienced some amount of floodings, the KwaZulu-Natal region. In Ghana here, this year we have experienced so much flooding that we are not able to even cope with ourselves. All over the world it is going on. Then there is this logging of trees and forest reserves and so on and so forth. Now, one major issue, environmental hazard, that is currently a huge problem in Ghana and many other countries, including South Africa, is illegal mining. In Ghana here, the local term is galamsey. And here we have people going onto river bodies and trying to do surface mining, trying to find gold using mercury and all sort of other chemicals in the water bodies to just find gold. And these people are doing it because they want, first of all, there's no job, they want quick money, and so on and so forth, right? Forests, cocoa farms are being destroyed. Farms that are supposed to produce food for the people are now being destroyed and being used for this illegal money, because this is the fastest way of getting money. They can't wait for a year, 2 years for their cocoa plants to mature, for them to sell for money. Now, this one, they go there within a couple of months, weeks, days, depending on how lucky you get, you can get enough gold to sell and get money for yourself and your family. So it's a big issue here, and even currently, all our major radio station TVs are talking about these things. All major rivers in the country are polluted, and the water companies are warning that if we don't put a stop to this, they are going to stop giving us water to drink, because they now have to put in a lot of chemicals to clean the water before they come into our taps. So they are also complaining. So it's a big problem, environmental hazard, health hazard, and so on and so forth. Now, the injustice here is that when you go into detail, you find out that those who are sponsoring these local miners with equipment, with chemicals and all that, are from the big cities, right? And so the impact that they get from the hazard that they create is very, very minute compared to the local people who have to bear the direct effect of the mining on the environment. Here, they are drinking water because here, these are remote villages within the forest areas. They rely only on the river for drinking water, and they use this same water for cooking and bathing and all that. Now, these rivers are polluted, and they are still forced to use this water as drinking water, and they get so many health hazards from that. Meanwhile, the big men and women who are behind it sit in the capital city here and basically have very limited effect of the hazard they have caused on themselves, because they can afford the bottled water, they can afford all the other essence that they need to make it work for them. So that is the injustices there, right? The lack of irresponsible use of the natural resources for current and future generation is one. And then the imbalance between those who benefit from the galamsey or the illegal mining and those who bear its adverse social, economic, health, and environmental impacts. So coming down to how African ethics could help, we need to then think about how traditional African societies used to preserve nature. How did they relate with the environment, and what lessons there can we pick for ourselves in terms of addressing the environmental challenges and also addressing the injustices that are involved. So when we read the literature on African environmental ethics, we realized that very little has been said about an African environmental justice theory. African scholars have been concerned with trying to forge an ethic of the environment from the African perspective to address, the various ethical problems environmental problem that is ongoing. But we observed that there was some common principles running through all of these African environmental ethical theories. Now, one of the important things we realized was that the scholars have understood that in traditional relationship, in the African sense, the traditional relationship with nature, men and women recognize the importance of water, air, and land management. In so doing, they had within their everyday living, whether they knew it or they thought about it, it was evident in how they lived with nature, right? That the ethics of not taking more than you need was a moral code that they had understood among themselves. Of course, somebody may say that this day you cannot live with this ethics or this code because of scarcity of natural resources. You cannot go to the forest and say, okay, let me just take what I need for myself today and come back tomorrow, because by the time you come back tomorrow, somebody else will have come for it. So these days, because of scarcity of resources, it's difficult to live by this principle. We prefer to go with the capitalist principle where you take as much as you can, not just for yourself, but also go and sell to the next person so you can make money as much as you can for yourself, for your family and all that, right? That's the capitalist system that we have now. And somebody may argue that, well, it is the condition that has made it so. And so we cannot blame us. But we are looking at the fundamental principles that these people use to practice. So the ethics of not taking more than you need from nature is referred to by some as the ethics of care or ethics of nature relatedness. And this is by the Nigerian Segun Ogungbemi. That is how he defined the ethics. It says it's the ethics of care or ethics of nature relatedness. And he explained that the ethics of nature relatedness can be regarded as an ethics that leads human beings to seek to coexist peacefully with nature and treat it with some reasonable concern for its worth, survival, and sustainability. So in this ethics, human beings tend to try to live peacefully with nature. They treated nature with some sort of respect because they realized that their survival is intertwined with the natural environment as well. And this is not like hierarchy of beings where man is supposed to be on top and so must use the environment as much as they can to sustain themselves. It was a mutual respect such that you take as much as you want from nature only and make sure that it is sustainable for the next time. So there was much concern for survival and sustainability. Another philosopher, Godfrey Tangwa, who is from Cameroon, called his observation as eco-biocommunitarian. And he explained it to be what? The recognition and acceptance of interdependence and peaceful coexistence between the earth, plants, and animals, as well as humans. So you can see that between Tangwa, who relied on observation from his traditional Cameroon, and then Segun Ogungbemi, who relied on observation from his traditional Nigerian people, they all realized that within the traditional African ethics of environment, there was this recognition that the earth or nature was part of the community. And so if community is supposed to survive, we need to treat community as part of us. We are not superior to community. We are part of the community, including the natural environment. So there's a resolve to coexist peacefully with both the earth, plants, and everything else in nature. So the African traditional outlook tends to be more cosmically humble, more respectful of other people, and more cautious in their attitude to plants, animals, and inanimate things, and to the various invincible forces in the world. Thus, Tangwa believes traditional Africans are more disposed to what he calls an attitude of live and let live, right? So this is disposition to live so that the other person will also be able to live so that the other creature will also survive, live such that the plants too will also survive. Is this principle, ethical principle, that runs through traditional sense of living. And so it shows in their everyday ways of life. And it tells in how they dealt with the natural world also. So we, myself and Professor Ochimenu and Sebunya from Uganda, we looked at these principles, ethical principles that these African environmentalists had unearthed. And we said, okay, then from these principles, how do we then create a theory that will address the environmental injustices that is going on in Africa and across the world? We realized that for us to get an environmental justice theory that addresses all the various aspects of environmental injustice in terms of distribution, in terms of correction, in terms of procedure, and all the other aspects, in terms of looking at the future generations too as well, then we need a theory that incorporates the African principles of what? Environmental care. That is nature relatedness, live and let live, and the ethics of care that these philosophers have mentioned. So we came up with the eco-collective responsibility theory. And this—
just to mention to you that we have about 1 minute, if you can try wrap up in about a minute.
All right, I'm almost done. So the eco-collective responsibility theory asserts that the environment is a public good whose resources should be enjoyed by everyone in the community, regardless of their gender, race, economic status, or even political affiliation, right? However, the consumption of these environmental resources should come with a collective duty of care for these resources by everyone. Collective responsibility towards the environment should be analyzed from a local community level. So what we had in mind is that an environmental theory where there is community involvement, where we recognize our individuality as well as our collectivity with other human beings, as well as nature as a whole, right? So we consider ourselves, we consider various aspects of nature. We also look into the future, what we can also leave behind for the future generation as well. We thought that this can be achieved by involving civil societies within the communities, involving the local traditional leaderships and all that. Now, we wrote this paper back in 2017, but upon further observation, we realized that this is not working, because sometimes you go into this community and you realize that the local traditional leaders themselves are part of the problem. They will take money from these foreigners, the Chinese and everybody, and then they will even give them lands to go and do this illegal mining and destroy the various water bodies. And so that's why I was kind of excited when I was told about this ecocide proposal, because people need to be accountable for their destruction that they are doing to the natural. And when there's such international punitive measures, I think it will add to the traditional theories that we are propounding to check the imbalances and the biases that is going on in the environmental destruction. So thank you very much for listening to me. I know I rushed through everything, but I also hope I make sense. Thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks, Stephen. You absolutely did, and you outlined some of the underlying principles coming from an African perspective of harmonious coexistence, peaceful coexistence, which are so important in many ways. And we may have time in the questions to just discuss the differences between individual, perhaps, and collective approaches and relational approaches, which are more profound in Africa in many ways. But without further ado, I want to move on to our last but not least speaker, Jojo Mehta, who co-founded Stop Ecocide in 2017, alongside barrister and legal pioneer, the late Polly Higgins, to support the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court. She is the executive director of Stop Ecocide International and has overseen the remarkable growth of that movement, now represented in 34 countries, websites in a range of languages, while coordinating legal developments, a range of diplomacy and public narratives. She is the chair of the charitable Stop Ecocide Foundation and the convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide, which I think she's going to share with us a little bit later. She's a graduate of Oxford and London universities and has also spoken around the world on environmental harm and ecocide in general. We look forward very much to your presentation. Over to you, Jojo.
Thank you so much, David. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. And so much of what we've heard kind of feels so relevant to why this law is so needed at this time. So yeah, as David said, our advocacy work has been going on for some years, and actually was, preceded by awareness raising by my dear departed colleague for some years before that. But what we're seeing at the moment is a really fast kind of gathering momentum around this concept and around the actual possibility of adding ecocide to the list of international crimes, alongside genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And I think that one of the things that we're facing at the moment is a huge rising frustration, and I could sort of feel it in Stephen's talk just now as well, that the action at the top level in terms of what needs to be done to retain a livable world is currently not being held accountable, but also the action that's been promised, I would say as well, from the highest level, is not being fulfilled in a way that's commensurate to the crisis that we're facing. And so, effectively, within the current parameters, I can completely see how Alex's predictions potentially about displacement of persons and potential increase of violence and so on look terrifyingly likely. However, I'd like to bring a little bit of hope into the conversation. And I think that one of the things that we're dealing with in this context is that as human beings, we've been around for a good few thousand years, and we're very much kind of creatures of habit. And what we have, what we're seeing in the world at the moment is a rate of change and a kind of level of novelty that is just way beyond anything that any species has had to deal with. And so, our corporate and political decision makers have got skills and technologies at their command that have led humanity to an exceptional level of, accomplishment and productivity. But as a result, our most vital ecosystems and keystone species, and so in other words, our ability to survive and thrive, because as both previous speakers have pointed out, we're not apart from nature, we're a part of nature. So, all of this is now at stake. And I think also what was great about what Stephen just brought up is that when we think about the cultures that are best at being custodians of the natural world, and we're looking at various indigenous populations around the world who we know are, although barely 5% of the global population, are actually coexistent with 80% of the world's richest biodiversity, and that can't be a coincidence. What we're looking at is that there's a kind of truth there that's being recognized, and that those cultures have not forgotten. And I think that this is very, very much the case, I think, with the traditional African understanding. And that understanding is that, when we damage nature, when we damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. And that is, and it is from that sort of deep understanding of reciprocity, if you like, that we realize that the not taking more than one needs and the actual coexistence with nature around us is so important. And one of the key milestones that's happened in the development of this movement was the convening of a panel of lawyers last year to bring together a consensus legal definition of ecocide that could be taken to governments to discuss as a starting point for moving forward with taking this crime forward at the international level. And in this context, we actually did, and this was our foundation that convened this panel, and it was the first time that had been done in response to, if you like, political appetite. So there is definitely a moment at the moment where there is a growing awareness of, you know, this sort of precipice that we're sort of standing on as a species, actually. And we were approached by Swedish politicians who asked us to potentially, you know, to convene a consensus legal definition that they could practically approach their government with. And on the basis of that, we were able to convene these top lawyers from around the world. And one of the things we did at the very beginning was a public consultation. And we had lots of responses, hundreds of responses, actually, from, you know, academics, from lawyers, from interest groups and all different people. And we also convened a small advisory group of Indigenous spokespeople from the different continents. And what was really striking about that sort of small convening that happened prior to the lawyers convening was that none of them even used the term nature. They sometimes referred to Mother Earth, but the interesting understanding that was in that conversation was that everything was about culture, was about interaction, was about practice, was about how we interact with the natural world. And this whole idea of nature as other is a very Western concept. And interestingly, what it's led to, I mean, and tragically, what it's led to over the centuries is this very deep sense of alienation, you know, that we are other from nature, that we can treat nature as a bank of resources. And so what was really hugely useful was to be able to bring that information, that feedback, you know, to the drafting panel as part of the considerations for them to approach when they were drafting that definition. And what we have seen emerge is really quite a remarkable and actually a very concise definition of ecocide. And I'm casting about a bit because actually what's so wonderful about it is that it's so, here we go. The definition that emerged from that convening was so concise that it fits on the back of a business card. And so I always like to show that because it's really remarkable when you're dealing with politicians. It really, really helps because they're always incredibly busy and they don't want to read 20 pages of regulations. So if you can present it like this, it really makes things a lot easier. And what I'll do, in fact, I'm actually going to share my screen very briefly so that you can see the, excuse me a second. That was my little daughter, aged 1. It's on my alarm. I apologise. So I'm gonna share my screen briefly to show you all the definition that emerged from that process. There, can we all see that? Great. So this is actually really quite straightforward. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, there is a further paragraph that defines what each of those terms refer to, and actually under what defines severe, I'm happy to say that those consultations at the beginning of the drafting process influenced that to a significant extent, and actually severe cultural harm via environmental destruction was also included under severe. And I think that's super important. I mean, we could think about contexts like the mining company in Australia, for example, that destroyed this ancient sacred site to the Aboriginal people. And that under this definition would actually be ecocide. But what we're seeing here, I'm going to very briefly go through sort of 3 key points in this. And then what I'll talk about is, how this is progressing. And I think what we'll see is that there is actually a growing appetite and interest in moving this forward at the top level. And I think that what criminalizing ecocide at the international level can do is bring individual responsibility to those top level decision makers. And that is, I think, precisely what, in a sense, was being sort of called for in a way at the end of Stephen's talk just now. So there are 3 key aspects to this definition that's worth just highlighting. I mean, obviously, I could spend a whole hour just talking about it, but let's keep it short for now. firstly, this is phrased as crime of endangerment. Now, what we don't want to have to do is wait until half the planet's destroyed and then try and work our way back to find out who's at fault. So one of the key elements here is the fact that it's acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of the harm happening. In other words, it's acts that threaten the severe level of harm, which are the crime in and of themselves. And that is similar to the war crime, for example, of launching an attack at a civilian population. Regardless of what actually happens to that population, launching that attack that creates the threat effectively is the crime. And it's very similar with this. And of course, that's incredibly useful in terms of creating a level of deterrence. And ultimately, that is what criminal law is about. There are environmental laws, of course, in place around the world, and often they're notable for their lack of enforcement, or for their inability to be enforced, or perhaps more fundamentally, and this goes back to the mindset, the way that they're simply not taken as seriously as crimes that affect people and property. And our whole legal system has been built up effectively on this sort of rather alienated stance of human beings as lords and masters of the natural world. So to create a level of deterrence in this way, using criminal law, I think is really super important. And that sort of way that it's framed as it's the threat that is the crime is very important in that. The other thing is it has to be, the second point is it has to be, the harm threatened has to be severe. Now we're looking at an international crime, and this is not something that is going to solve every environmental ill at a stroke. In other words, we're not talking about the cutting down of the trees on the village green. We're not talking about, a small localized situation. We're looking at the worst examples, if you like. And one might think of, although, probably most lawyers won't give out specific examples because, of course, as with every criminal case, it will always depend on the facts around the particular case. But the kinds of things one might think of are, a whole river system that's polluted, for example, large cases of deforestation, serious oil pollution, such as in the Niger Delta or in Ecuador from oil extraction. Potentially, I imagine that things that could also be included could be things like industrial disasters that could have been foreseen or could have been prevented had safety protocols or design recommendations been followed. For example, Deepwater Horizon or Fukushima. So we're talking about, looking at things that are at quite a severe level. And then the third aspect, which is this, it actually shows, it comes at the beginning of the phrase, but it's a sort of second level of threshold, is the acts need to be unlawful or wanton. Now, this was actually interesting because when the lawyers were discussing it, I remember thinking, well, hang on a minute, lots of ecocidal activity is actually permitted, and shouldn't we just be making it across the board, threats of severe harm? But what we realised, and what the panel realised, and it was fascinating to listen to these lawyers discussing it, was that bodies of law are different in different jurisdictions. And actually an awful lot of environmental destruction is already unlawful. And this is something that Stephen highlighted very well, I thought, in his talk just now, that actually a lot of these polluting events are actually already forbidden. They shouldn't be happening. And of course, when you add the level of an international crime to a breach of regulation, you are putting a very serious incentive to avoid committing that crime in place. And that's actually very important. It's also very important that effectively not all countries have the same laws. And so what you're not doing is treading on sort of across the board on existing regulation. What you're doing instead is kind of almost future-proofing that definition by effectively saying that any laws that are developed from now into the future will enhance this law. So, they won't cut across each other. It actually sort of floats on top, if you like, of every aspect of law that's developed. And that's very important when there are so many people at the local level and also in specific areas developing, with great knowledge and expertise, improvements in certain particular areas of law. So that's very important too. But in order to get to those areas where the activity may be permitted, that was why that wanton word that was in there as well was also added, because that means that effectively provides for the possibility that even if a particular activity is permitted, if the damage that it will create is disproportionately severe, then that too potentially can fall within the remit of ecocide. So I realize I've only got a few more minutes, but I would just like to give you a flavor of where this is heading, because since this definition came out, we had a huge surge of interest around the world, because I think it's made it very real for people. It's made it real for politicians, it's made it real for the media, it's made it real for, and of course it supports an awful lot of environmental campaigning work that's going on. In fact, we've yet to encounter an environmental campaign that will not be supported by making ecocide a crime. So, and where sort of, let's say 3 years ago, no governments were talking about this, we now have a situation where discussion of ecocide is on public record in, I think, 24 countries now, which are member states of the International Criminal Court, which are signatories to the Rome Statute. So this is a very live conversation. And there's already the beginnings of, potentially a cross-regional group of states which are interested in moving this forward. And that's been it's been a very fast momentum, but I think it's been due to a number of different things. I think the definition was really key, but also the mobilization across the world of ordinary people has also made a big difference. So when we think of sort of the protest movements like Fridays for Future, the school strikes that spread globally from the influence of Greta Thunberg, who I actually saw last week in Sweden, and also other movements, such as actually in Africa, there's a movement called Stop the Manganese, and in starting in the UK, but now across globally, there was also Extinction Rebellion that you've probably heard of, and those are movements that have caused quite a bit of controversy. But what they have done is opened up the conversation in the media and in the political world, so that what we had been saying for actually many years already, suddenly was able to sort of land in that space, if you like. So there is certainly, I think it also responds to the global frustration at the lack of action at the top level. And I think that, again, this comes back to, in a way, we've developed over the last few decades, sort of as a culture, and particularly the sort of dominant colonizing culture, has developed certain sort of grooves and ways of approaching things which are ultimately in the capitalist mold, which again has just been described to us in the previous talk. And it's actually quite difficult to sort of reconceptualize things unless you have the framework to do it. And this is where we believe that bringing in a criminal law of this kind can really help. It actually can create a kind of enabling condition for genuine implementation of positive strategic change. Because, and I say this as a former entrepreneur, in the sense that if you have clear parameters, it really helps to unleash sort of creativity and innovation, in the same way as if you go to an artist and just say, make me an artwork, it's going to be a bit of an open remit. Whereas if you say, I need a portrait and I need it this size, or we need an essay and we need it like that, creating the framework is really, really important. And one of the reasons, again, that it's important, and I will probably end on this, which I do feel is quite a hopeful note, which is that, this very concise definition, all my blur's doing funny things to it, but, being able to kind of hand this to people, not just to politicians, but to people who are working in particular sectors, people who really know their sector are going to look at this and they go, okay, what does this mean for my industry? Or if they're investors or insurers, what does this mean for where I'm going to put my money? What does this mean for the projects I'm going to underwrite? And actually what they will start doing is asking the right questions. And this is something that is, and I have to say, obviously this may slightly contrast to the, more pessimistic risk of sort of increasing violence and sort of far right domination that we were addressing at the beginning of this session. But I do have a kind of a faith in human ingenuity. I mean, when we think about, I'm thinking of an activity like fracking, which is definitely being threatened in certain parts of Africa at present. It's a particularly pernicious and polluting way of extracting oil and gas. when you think of all of the intellectual capital, all of the financial capital that went in over decades to developing that particular technique, I refuse to believe that we're not capable of directing finance, intellectual capital, dedication towards, practices and approaches that are far healthier. But we just need to have the boundaries that say the finance can't flow in that particular direction anymore. And money flows like water. Once you put something in place to divert it, it has to start flowing in another direction. And I believe that once we start, and I think this is how the human mind works, when we ask the right questions, we start finding the answers. It's when we're stumped for what to ask that we end up in this kind of state of political and industrial inertia. So we very much hope that this momentum that's gathering now behind this law will actually contribute quite significantly to how this moves. And just to round off, there was a big section that appeared in a recent report called The Pivot Point, which was put together by the Race to Zero climate champions, and it was presented in New York Climate Week last week. And there was a whole section in there where they're obviously realizing that there needs to be not just a race to zero, but a race to regulation to help that arrive. And they actually invited from us and included in the report a whole section on ecocide law as a key driver in that direction. So on that hopefully hopeful note, I'll close for now and looking forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Jojo, for that excellent, also kind of giving us in a very compressed presentation some of the thinking around the whole crime of ecocide and your very important work in that regard. And I know I certainly have lots of questions coming from that as a lawyer myself, but I want to go to the chat because we have a lot of people having come in, and I invite others, if you want to put up your hand, please put up your hand. But I'm going to ask some of the questions from the chat. We're going to take about 20 minutes or so of questions for those of you who want to know about timing. So Jackie Dugard, in relation to Stephen's presentation, raised the question. She appreciates the point about environmental justice and essentially not really working in the Ghanaian society per se, but would it not apply really on a more global scale about environmental racism really being the in a sense being a concept that would be applicable more to more global relations? And I did see Stephen did reply to that and saying actually in a very powerful way, well, there needs to be a taking of responsibility within Ghana itself. And I wanted to add a question to that, Stephen, because I've also been in the west of Ghana and engaged with some of the issues around mining and fundamental rights. And actually, one of the things that came about, you laid out the point about Galamsey and illegal miners, or the notion of illegal mining is itself complicated because many people in that environment don't accept it's illegal. They don't believe that it's actually that the original granting of licenses to big multinational corporations was just in the first place. They think that those licenses, that mining should have taken place from the people themselves. And so in a way, these big multinationals have actually created part of the problem, and therefore people feel that they're taking back only what was actually deserving, which they deserved. So there was an original problem, which is leading to a greater sort of justice issue, and now affecting, as you've shown us, very severely the environment. So that's, I'm going to ask 3 questions here, so everyone has a chance from the chat. So Stephen, please keep that in mind. We got a question also from Jackie. I'm sure this perhaps Jojo, you can write in separately in the chat, but are there good resources on the legal definitions of ecocide and the process around recognition of this? I'm sure there are some that you can direct to. We also have a question from Mel Williams about the fact that we often think politics determines access to the environment, but actually this discussion now suggests that the environment actually shapes our politics. And she asked for a comment about that as well. And we have G. Siga ask us, thank you so much. In light of environmental justice, how would you justify family smallholder and women farming, looking at climate unfriendly land use management and practices, especially in rural Africa, taking into consideration how socioeconomic stress, low technology levels, and environmental resource stress due to interlinked reasons like overpopulation, poverty, climate change, unsupportive politics and policies. And talking here about the point that people need to eat and survive. So I'm going to stop there for some comments. hand over, Stephen. I think I directed the first question to you, and then give Alex and Jojo a chance to come in on any of these issues that they would like to. Stephen.
All right, thank you very much for the question. Yes, the issue of environmental racism, globally, it affects Ghana as well, because if you look at how the West tends to dump all their industrial waste in Africa, especially Ghana, Nigeria, yes, we are victims of environmental racism. But internally, if you look at the people themselves, the population of Ghana is mostly Black people like myself. So there's no race challenge there. What, like I said in the response in the chat, is that what we experience is more of classism, right? So where you have the well-to-do, dumping all the environmental issues on those in the very remote areas. Yes, you mentioned about the big mining industries, making the laws, and then everybody going against the law now becomes an illegal mining in a way. That is very true, and that also speaks to the injustice involved. But then the issue with these people we are terming illegal mining is how they do it, right? By law, you're not supposed to mine certain distance close to river bodies, but they don't care about this law. They actually would do it close to the river body, even inside the river body, right? And the machines they use and how the chemicals they use, all of these things are not checked by the government. That is what is causing environmental hazard to the drinking water they themselves use, and to the other animals that survive on the water bodies as well. So that's what I want to say.
Stephen. It raises really interesting questions about legitimacy and law, where there's original unjust distributions.
Exactly, yeah.
Over to Alexander, would you like to comment on any of these questions?
Great question, very thought-provoking questions. Yeah, if I can speak to this idea about policy being shaped by access to the environment, and I think if I'm not misreading it, my take on it is that very often, historically, it is about access to the environment that has shaped policies, but not in the way that I think the question is framed, but rather in terms of shaping policies about extraction and access to resources. And we continue to see this in places all around the world in terms of laws being crafted and shaped because of these international kind of relationships. And whereas Stephen was speaking about that it's more about classism rather than racism, if we look globally at some of these systems of exploitation, race and class and religion, all of these kind of things, I think have played an important part in helping shape and justify some of these unequal kinds of relationships. Yeah, I'll stop there for right now.
Thank you so much. And to Jojo, there's a particular question for you from Tali about the gas line disaster happening now in the Russian war against Ukraine. Is that the kind of thing that can be considered ecocide or can fall under a war crime? And she actually asked, what's the relationship between war crimes and other international crimes and ecocide? Like, where would it fit in the Rome statute?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, in fact, the chief prosecutor in Ukraine is actually wanting to prosecute, as I understand it, is wanting to prosecute Russia for ecocide. And interestingly, Ukraine is one of the few countries that have ecocide in their national legislation already. It just hasn't really been used in the past. And most of the countries that do have that, there's only a handful of them, are actually former Soviet countries, because when they were sort of establishing their own bodies of law in the 90s, it was the same time that the Rome Statute was being drafted, and it was one of the things that was under consideration. But there is actually a war crime of severe, widespread and long-term destruction to the environment. But it only can be prosecuted. I mean, it's got this kind of balancing factor where the damage has to be disproportionate to the military advantage gained. And of course, the problem with that is that ultimately you're kind of asking the perpetrator whether, to be the judge of whether it's, whether it fits their military, the advantage gained. So actually it's never been prosecuted. And so, I mean, this is one of the reasons why, it appears that having some kind of crime that defends ecological resources and the living world per se is important to have separate to the existing crimes, because although of course in the case of the Ukraine there will actually be considerable human harm involved, when we look at the global situation of destruction of the environment, the large problem is that actually most of this is actually happening in peacetime. It's just not happening all the time. And so, the necessity for having the additional crime in place, I think, is fairly clear. But that doesn't mean that in the context of the Ukraine, there won't end up being some kind of case around ecocide, because that is actually fairly likely that could happen. And I think just speaking a little bit to the question that the other two speakers just addressed, I think that there's also a way in which, one of the part of the thinking in a way behind putting ecocide alongside those crimes of most serious concern to humanity as a whole, which is how the international crimes are defined, is precisely the possibility, if you like, of creating a shift in attitudes to the natural world. We would never go to a government and say, can I kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? It wouldn't cross your mind, and you couldn't do it legally anyway, because there's such a profound taboo around taking human life. But we just don't have that taboo around severe destruction of nature. And, obviously there's a certain balance to be struck in the sense that a lot of human activity generally, uses nature. We eat food, we grow food, etc. But it's about the level of destruction. And so by putting those two things alongside each other, there's a kind of, it may seem a simple thing just to add a crime to a list of crimes, but actually the effect is potentially quite profound, because once one starts to sort of feel that, oh, this is as serious as that, then our whole sort of attitude to nature can potentially change. And I think, again, the relationship, I think it's really important. I think one of the aspects that has exacerbated our current situation is this, is the fact that the sort of, this kind of dominant culture of capitalism and colonialism also goes along with, very sophisticated technology and and great ease of travel. And what that kind of means is that a lot of Westerners have kind of lost connection to their land as home. And I've really noticed that the way that Indigenous spokespeople speak, but also you find it in countries like Canada and Australia, where there's a very strong sense of the land having been colonized, that talks and webinars will open with an acknowledgement of the land, of where people have come from. And it's actually quite hard to care for something that you don't have connection with. And when people care about things like, caring about people, then they will, they start to make those kinds of adjustments that are that ultimately become cultural adjustments. And I was just listening to the UK journalist George Monbiot speaking at the Gothenburg Book Fair the other day. And one of the things he says, which I think is rather lovely actually, is that in his experience, the vast majority of people are actually altruistic, cooperative. But the way he puts it, we're kind of a lot of those who are in power are actually, have more psychopathic tendencies. So, because our system, the capitalist system, kind of creates a situation where that attitude floats to the top, where in fact there's actually an extraordinary kind of communal spirit when you simply talk to people. So, for me, that's kind of where the hope lies, and why the conversation that we nurture is as broad as possible in order to have the politicians come to the party, because they never do unless everyone's already there having a good time.
Okay, so thank you, Jojo. I'm going to go in reverse order now. I see, Stephen, you've got your hand up, so we'll take you, but give you a chance, and perhaps this is going to be a kind of concluding comment from you, but it's also going to be a kind of challenging. So Jojo, I'm broadly sympathetic, but one of my worries is that you say you kind of set up an opposition between the decision makers and us. And my reading of environmental destruction is actually a lot of the problem is us. And if you take something like, we all like to ignore the basically meat eating, for example, which is causing massive destruction in the world, right, in the current way it's taking place. But we get absolved because ecocide is really something other people do who very senior and high up. So I want to ask you that question firstly. isn't the problem with ecocide actually and the movement towards that, actually it's saying it's something very rare, it's something very, very exceptional, it's very extreme, it's like genocide, right? Rather than something we are all participating in as criminals, effectively, through participating in this process. And isn't that movement in some way doing that? Right, and I'll ask, I
think that's a wonderful question, and I will try and answer it as quickly as possible because I realise we haven't got a lot of time. I think, of course, I believe we're all responsible for our particular parts in all of this. But I will also say that I think the corporate PR machine has done a fantastic job of making all of us blame ourselves and each other. Now, if I go into a supermarket and everything's covered in plastic, that is not a decision I made. That's a regulatory decision made at the highest level. If I drive a fossil fuel car because it's the only thing I could afford, that's not a decision I made. That's not a consumer choice. That's a fact. That's a result of, government subsidy and industry support. So, effectively, it's not, I don't think the two things are exclusionary at all. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. They're two things that go together. But I think unless we address the decisions that are made at the highest level, this is not about punishment. This is, obviously, I don't hesitate for a second in saying that there will be cases that are taken once it's in place. But the real power of it is just the fact that people can see it coming and kind of go, oh, God, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, well, in a few years, we won't be able to do this. So we're going to need to strategically start thinking now about what we should be doing. And the thing is, what that will mean to all of those millions, billions of people who can't afford to choose to do the right thing environmentally will be given better options. And I think that's really important. And, for example, the meat eating thing. For me, it's not about the what, it's about the how, it's about the scale. There are plenty of places in the world where you can't go vegan because actually the subsistence livelihood is based on livestock. And so actually it's almost a slightly Western colonial thing to start telling everybody that nobody should eat meat. It's about context. It's about going to as local as possible for the actual harmonious ways of farming and of dealing with the environment. But it's about putting the outer parameters in place so that those who are at the highest sort of level actually have to pay attention to the potential personal consequences and thus make better decisions.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. And I'm gonna jump there to Stephen. Stephen, you wanted to come in, but I wanted to ask you also about what you thought about, perhaps to get in conversation with Jojo about, because the idea of a crime is quite an individualized idea, right? It's quite a focus on individual responsibility. And my understanding of African ethics is in some ways much more collective in a certain way. It's about us as a community, yes, and the interrelationship we bear as a community. So how would you see, and also actually in some ways there's not a very easy relationship with crime, right? In some senses, we have to own what is done criminally as a community. So I was wondering about your reflections on the issue of crime and how it links with African ethics.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that was why I raised my hand, because when I look at the definition given to us for ecocide, unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe, so I feel like as a legal instrument, it's going to be very difficult to prove that the person did this act with the knowledge, right? That somebody could just allude that he did it accidentally or they didn't know. So, and here, I think that is where the African collective responsibility has an upper hand here. So here, we are saying that do not focus on just the person who brought about the harm, but how collectively we can deal with the situation. So yes, of course, we are not saying people should not be held responsible, they should. So within African ethics, there's a deep sense of virtue ethics also, character-based ethics, and which of course the focus is how we could relate with each other communally. That's the focus. So I believe that if we incorporate this virtue ethics principle within people in terms of character, so that they are not always focused on attaining things that will inure to their personal benefit, but rather to the community good, what we call the common good, then we take away individual responsibility towards collective responsibility. right? So that every action decision you make, so here it is preemptive more than, I don't know the opposite of preemptive, more than the other side, right? So that is how we should look at it from. It's not a straightforward thing. I cannot sit here and say, this is the way, but it's more of building the character in the person to see that actions affect the collective rather than the individual, so that it informs their everyday action. And then there we will hope that they will abide by that. Yeah, it's not a straightforward thing. But the legal instrument is important though, because I mean, ethics can go only as much as it can. We need a legal instrument to deter people from actually going beyond. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. And last but not least, Alex, you ended very, with that sort of notion that you would give us some kind of sense on how you thought we could avoid that descent from climate change, displacement, down to conflict, genocide. What do you think about ecocide as one dimension of that? And what other aspects do you think are necessary to avoid that slide into genocide?
Right. I'm tempted to say I lied. But actually, I am more hopeful nowadays than I was when I began doing work in this area. But I also recognize that I don't believe that there are short or easy kind of fixes. I know many people believe like technology, for example, is going to get us out of this. And there are all these projected concepts in terms of, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, or putting satellites in orbit that have mylar shields that would, reduce solar radiation. But honestly, I think it's a trap to think that technology got us into this, so it's going to get us out of it. Until we really begin to reevaluate, to change how we relate to the world around us, we would just be replicating the same kind of things, which is why I love Jojo's comments about changing culture, right? I think changing culture, and I'm beginning to see that, it seems to me, we're waking up and more people are paying attention to this. But on the other hand, the sociologist in me knows that cultural change is slow. Cultural change is difficult. When you're trying to change these things that are deeply embedded in people's practices and traditions and so forth, it doesn't happen quickly. And what we know is that the clock is ticking. The window for us to really be effective in changing things is closing. And we know that these processes and mechanisms we've set into motion have been progressing faster than originally believed, right? That the original IPCC ideas and their timelines were hopelessly conservative. I'm a criminologist. I do believe in the power of law. I do believe that legal mechanisms serve really important kinds of things, but I also know that it's not the solution, right, by itself. We do know that the ways laws are created and the ways in which they're applied often reflect different kinds of imbalances, or there are just practical kinds of considerations. We also know that, for example, the research that's been done on the Genocide Convention and application of it indicates that its deterrence value is very, very limited. So do I just, where do we go from here? I do think that we need to be exploring all of these. We need to be looking at ways in which we build resiliency in various kinds of communities, and we need to do it very carefully so that we're not replicating the same kinds of paternalistic colonial patterns that helped create this mess, right? But the truth of the matter is that those countries, those regions that are least responsible for climate change are those who have the fewest resources for ameliorating, for adapting, for building resiliency. So how do we navigate some of those kind of considerations? How do we figure that out? And then I guess the last thing I would say is one of the things that the criminological research shows that I've highlighted is that very often difficult times create a lot of anxiety, create reactive kinds of mindsets, and these have often been exploited. But the research also shows that during very difficult kinds of times, during times of crisis, communities can and do come together. people do work together to find solutions to help each other. And that in crisis moments, some of the differences that seem to be so vast, whether it's about race or religion or politics and so forth, those kinds of differences get lost in people's common humanity as they come together to try to help each other and protect each other. And to me, it seems that it's those kind of instincts, those kind of tendencies and qualities that we need to nurture, that we need to really facilitate. We need to find leaders who are able to help us develop those kinds of values and attitudes, recognizing our common humanity. And we need to work against those leaders, those kinds of people who bring us further apart, those kind of things. No simple answers, but at least we're beginning to wake up and starting to ask the questions and work in our own ways, locally, regionally, internationally, and so forth, to affect enduring change.
Thank you very much. It's a very good way to bring this to a close. No simple answers. We heard about different dimensions here in the seminar today of what potentially can happen. We've heard about sort of various ethical perspectives and also a very exciting legal initiative around ecocide and the use of criminal law to try and address some of the environmental harms that are taking place. As I mentioned, part of our job is to encourage a discussion of these things and some of the issues that we wanted to discuss. And I was watching a wonderful BBC series on the planets, which shows how truly unique we are on the Earth. And yet human beings are ruining it, and we are turning this world into an uninhabitable space, either through what we do to each other or through what we do to the world around us. We can see the future in other planets as to what can happen as well. And it's up to us ultimately to avoid that and to take the necessary steps and be activists to do so. So thank you to everyone attending. Please be involved. Please take responsibility yourself. And also there are a number of initiatives that you've heard about. Thank you to all who attended, and thank you to our wonderful speakers as well, and to all who put this seminar together. I wish you all, wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for your attendance. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.